We're recording. Hello, is this thing on? Okay, if you hear goes nothing, silly guy 99, we're gonna read Being and Nothingness by Jean-Paul Sartre, or Sartre, or whatever. The principle of modern existentialism, which I don't really actually know what it is, but I just bought the book because I'm a LARPer. But yeah, that one guy who LARPs philosophy. I guess I can literally just look it up. I might as well just do that instead of fucking pretending that I'm intelligent. What is existentialism? Individual freedom, choice, arguing that life has no inherent meaning, so that you must live it. You must choose your own path in life. Okay. Oh, okay, if you say so. Yeah, sure. That sounds pretty good. Anyway. Above all, okay, shall I read at the beginning? First published by French in 1943. I just read this. New translation for 60 years. Our life, what gives our life significance is not something pre-established for us by God, but for something we are responsible. So I guess existentialism is like you being responsible for your own happiness and choosing your own path in life and all that good stuff. And like God doesn't make if you believe in this, then I guess you don't believe in fate. But honestly, to an extent, I believe a little bit in faith. But I guess we can talk about that in 2 seconds. Combining this with the unsettling view that human experience is characterized by radical freedom and the inescapability of choice, Sartre introduces us to a cast of ideas and characters that are part of the philosophical legend, anguish, the bad faith of the memorable waiter in the cafe, sexual desire, ooh, spicy, can't wait to get to that, and the look of the other, brought to life by Sartre's famous description of someone looking through a keyhole. Above all, by arguing that we alone create our values and that human relationships are characterized by hopeless conflict, Sartre paints a stark and controversial painting picture of our moral universe and one that resonates strongly today. This new translation includes an insightful translation's introduction and some other stuff, I guess. And here's some people glazing him. Jean-Paul Sartre is one of the great philosophers of the 20th century. He was a renowned novelist, dramatist, and political activist. He was drawn to Henry Bergson's Time and Free Will, and then I guess he made his own book that was basically the same. He served as a meteorologist before being captured by German troops. He continues to write in captivity and published his great trilogy of novels, Les Chemins de la Liberté. That was my best French accent. Published in 1964. He was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature but declined it. Holy, what a chad. And then he got arrested for civil disobedience, so never mind. One does not arrest Voltaire or Voltaire. He died on April 15th, 50,000 mourners. Wow, lucky guy. How many mourners do you think you'll have at your funeral? And here's people glazing Sarah Richmond, which for creating this thing, which is cool. So if you want to read that, you might as well just pause it. Might as well just pause the video, because I guess Sarah Richmond deserves some glaze too. An essay in phenomenological ontology. Phenomenological. Phenomenological ontology. Okay. So I guess I'm just gonna read this from, beginning to end. But I'll probably not get very far. I'll probably just forget about it and stop reading. I have a ton of philosophy books too. Actually, do I? Mm, actually, I look-y don't. I basically have this, and I have this too. The Critique of Pure Reason by Kant, and Philosophy for Dummies. Philosophy for Dummies. I have The Wisdom of Confucius, and I have like Nietzsche's, like all of Nietzsche's books, but you know, I didn't read all. I didn't read most of them because I'm a fucking LARP. It's a matter. It's a matter of reading comprehension. The basic writings of Nietzsche, but you know, is now the best time to get into philosophy? Yeah, probably. Anyway, these are the books, 100 pages of philosophical slop. You know, maybe we could just read the introduction, but like being able to read so much is just too much. Like we can read the introduction and then figure out other stuff. Richard Moran, with this new translation by Sarah Richmond, Satter's major work, Lettre de Niet, or Being in Nothingness, is available to the English-speaking world, you know, as never before. Not only is the translation itself a great improvement in accuracy and readability on the Hazel Barnes version published in 1956. Oh, sorry, I have to sneeze. Okay, never mind. The inadequacies of the Barnes translations has been notable for a long time. Okay, whatever. The world of philosophy in English has reasons to be grateful to Richmond and the people at Routledge for seeing this through. He was born in Paris, while difficult to determine, was no doubt considerable. It's influenced by the work of Henry Bergson, by Neo-Kantianism represented by Leon Brushvig. Is that G supposed to be there? He had already conceived for himself the dream of a manner of writing that would be healthy and philosophical at once. It was in 1932 that he had the famous meeting at a cafe with Raymond Aron, when Aron was back visiting Paris during the year he was spending at the Institut Français in Berlin, learning about the new philosophy called phenomenology. Phenomenology, as Beauvoir tells the story in The Prime of Life. We ordered the specialty of the house, apricot cocktails. Aron said, pointing to his glass. You see, my dear fellow, if you're a phenomenologist, you could talk about this cocktail glass and make philosophy out of it. Sutter turned pale with emotion at this. Here was just the thing he had been longing to achieve for years, to describe objects just as he saw and touched them, and extract philosophy from the process. Aron helped Sater obtain a fellowship in Berlin for the following year, where he immersed himself in Husserl and Heidegger, and wrote his critique of Husserl, The Transcendence of the Ego, and the bulk of his first novel, Nausea, published respectively in 1937 and 1938. Both works attracted considerable attention, but Satter's budding fame was cut short by the German invasion of Poland in 1939 and the general mobilization in France. Sader was called up and was captured by the Germans in 1940 and transferred to a prisoner of war camp in Trier. He does not describe the time there as having been harsh, and he seems to have spent most of his days teaching philosophy to fellow prisoners and working on the voluminous notebooks in which he sketched out the plan for his big book Being and Nothingness. After managing to get himself released in 1941, he returned to occupy Paris, where he sought unsuccessfully to form a resistance group, independent of the Gaullists and the Communists. For the remainder of the war, he was on his own account an intellectual resistant, and concentrated on finishing his magnum opus. It was published by Gallimard in 1943 at 722 pages, weighing precisely 1 kilogram. Precisely 1 kilogram. If John Paul Hahn is to be believed, helped with the initial sales since the book was being used as a weight measure at home when the normal brass weights had been confiscated by German authorities. What sort of book is this, and what is its philosophical importance now? Any account of its importance and genuine brilliance has to come to grips with the several different forms of obstacle to its reception today, both those intrinsic to the book and those stemming from the contemporary intellectual context. Part of the problem is Sader's own fame and the cultural saturation that was part of the reception of existentialism in France from the beginning. In the Paris of the 1950s, something called existentialism was not merely a school of philosophy, but an entire lifestyle, encompassing literature, music, film, and a succession of political stances. This broad influence was amplified by the fact that in France, as elsewhere, the post-war years were also the beginning of the first age of mass media and a new prominence of youth culture in European and American life. Sader's own personality as a provocateur and intellectual engagé, I don't know, lent itself to the context. He was on television almost as soon as television came to France, and was perhaps one of the first major philosophers to have his own radio show. In the decades following the war in France, he was rarely without an opinion or an opportunity for publishing it, and of course, he threw himself into various political crises of his day, creating a certain notoriety and gaining enemies among both the Catholic right and the communist left in France. The result of this cultural saturation is today everyone is entitled to an opinion about Saturn existentialism, however minimal one's exposure to his writing may be. This presence as cultural reference is itself unusual for a philosopher, and is an aspect of how his enduring fame is maintained even by his detractors. All philosophers wax and wane in their influence, and most can enjoy a posthumous existence in comfortable obscurity. But Sader stands out among the notable 20th century philosophers for the extent to which he is still invoked for condescension, seen less as a philosopher than as a provocation to be put down, both in intellectual circles and in the popular media. Another obstacle is the sheer length and the style of Being and Nothingness. It can be an impossible and infuriating text. One can only dream wistfully of what a ruthless editor might have been able to do with its bulk. The tone is often abrupt and peremptory, with little or no explanation given to key philosophical terms, whether German or French, in a manner that we have become used to among certain philosophers. Oh, it's too big. It's thought that the presumed audience of the work could only be for those whom such things as the distinction between the phenomenon of being and the being of the phenomenon is already quite familiar, and we are being invited to appreciate the unexpected spin the brilliant author is putting on these old ideas. It is extremely uneven as a piece of philosophical writing. Sometimes we do indeed get what look very much like arguments, powerful ones, and other times the setter puts his powers of description to genuinely illuminating use. But too often we get bold declarations, invidious distinctions, and a fondness for paradoxical formulation that seems to know no bounds. Satir himself paid a price for the difficulty of access of being and nothingness, and the fact that readers who were curious but not prepared to take on the 722 pages of the original had available to them a much shorter Satyrian text, a pamphlet really, called Existentialism is a Humanism, something dashed off and never intended for publication in the first place. In October 1943, in the early months of the liberation, Satir was persuaded by a friend to give what was to be a small public lecture on the new philosophy at the Club Maintenant. It turned into a huge event with an overflow crowd and people being carried out after having fainted from the heat and overcrowding. Satir spoke without notes. To help pay for the rental of the hall and the damage to the premises, the organizer prevailed upon Satir to agree to publish a version of his remarks for sale, which he agreed to do. As it is a text full of crudities, misstatements, and willful exaggerations for effect, it soon became far and away the most famous and widely read piece he ever wrote. It is still commonly cited as a representative of Satyrian existentialism by philosophers who should know better. A final obstacle to be mentioned is that so much of French thought since the 1960s and 1970s has proceeded from a assumed repudiation of Sartre. Being and nothingness is, among other things, the last great expression of the philosophy of the subject. That later French thought had expended so much energy in dismantling and decentering both structuralist, originally in the person of Claude Lévi-Strauss, and post-structuralist thinking such as Michael Foucault, Jacques Derrida, and Jacques Lacan began repudiating the Cartesian starting point of so many of the reflections in being and nothingness, as well as Sartre's appropriation of phenomenology and the early Heidegger. Okay, can I look up what structuralism is? First of all, I don't know what that is. Structuralism. A method of interpretation and analysis of human cognition, behavior, human structure in the way to a broader system, uncover the structural pattern that underlie all things that humans do, think, perceive, and feel. I'm reading off Wikipedia, by the way. Yeah, whatever. Okay. And by the way, this isn't even the first page of the book. Where's the first page? Yeah. It's gonna be a while since we can even start reading the book. All of this future reason is to welcome this new translation and the opportunity it gives readers in English to encounter this book with fresh eyes, for despite its flaws, it is still one of the great and engaging texts of 20th century philosophy. It is a text to struggle with, yes, but when the writing is at its best, it is rewarding and illuminating in ways that few major works of philosophy in the modern world can touch. Of course, like any philosophical text, it needs to be comprehended as a whole, but many of its famous sections on bad faith, on the look of the other, on various self-defeating strategies of love and desires, on freedom and responsibility, on the existential psychoanalysis of qualities, can be profitably read by themselves. Today it is easy to forget how daring this text is, and the different ways Sartre expanded the possible forms of philosophical writing. This new edition makes it available to a new generation of readers, like me and you. Different philosophers will have different reasons for engaging with being and nothingness today. From the perspective of the history of philosophy, it may be read as a remarkably ambitious attempt to inherit the phenomenology of Husserl and the early work of Heidegger in the context of a general metaphysical picture of the world and the place of human thought and action within it. Today, one may be skeptical about the very idea of such a general metaphysical picture, and in particular the dualism of being as such and nothingness, and yet still be impressed with the creative use to which it is put, and how Sartre is able to begin from these bare categories to an analysis of the difference between the category of ordinary objects, being in itself, and the categories of human life, being for itself. Despite rumors to the contrary, the idea of nothingness here has little to do with the despair or the contemplation of suicide. Rather, the idea of the negative is bound up with the most basic abilities to describe the world and pick out and discriminate objects themselves. Sartre never tires of alluding to Spinoza's formulation omnis determinatio est negatio. At the same time, the fundamental power of thought to negate, to assert difference, is also something that he seeks to derive from Husserl's basic thought about consciousness, itself an idea associated with Brentano. Consciousness is pure relatedness to an object, which is to say something other than itself, something it is not. Consciousness just is this basic capacity for relatedness to the world and the distinguishing of itself from the world it is directed upon. This assertion of difference is described as part of the annihilating action of consciousness. Oh, it's just like when Moog uses his Nihil attack in Elden Ring, bro. Wait, is this an Elden Ring reference? Sorry. Which enables Sartre to forge his unbreakable connection between consciousness as for itself and the freedom in action and in thought. For in the same way that a picture of the world as consisting purely of positive reality cannot account for the ability to grasp or even perceive the negative truth of, for instance, an object being fragile, breakable but not broken, or different from another one, or no longer what it once was, not to mention Pierre's absence from the cafe. So understanding human action requires the negative modes of attention involved in being underway with an action not yet completed, and then the capacity to step back from or posit one's freedom with respect to one's currently constituted motives and one's past, one's facticity, is that? Or, yeah, facticity. The stepping back or putting one's past out of play is the same annihilating capacity of consciousness, the capacity to distinguish, hold oneself separate from the facticity. Yeah, I'll look up what that word means too. Facticity meaning a quality or condition of being fact. So is it like factual? I already lost where I was reading. Yeah. Hold oneself separate from the facticity of what the world has made of one so far, and raise the question for oneself of how one is to relate oneself to this positive reality from here on. It is along these lines that we can see some of Sade's most provocative formulations are no mere paradox mongering. The human being is what is it is not, in the sense that, as agent, I am my relation to my unrealized possibilities. The action I am embarked on, I have not completed, and it not is not what it is. In the sense that in adopting the standpoint of freedom to my possibilities, I posit my difference from my past. Oh, sorry, I might have to move this up. I posit my difference from my past and the facticities of my situation just make up what I am so far. Here, as elsewhere, Sade's borrowings are as undeniable as the boldness and originality of his use of them, or the notions of negation, nothingness, and difference being stretched here to do too many different kinds of work as we move from the more purely metaphysical structure of the world to the story of action and human subjectivity. No, no doubt that is a question one may and should press throughout the reading of Being and Nothingness. But what remains impressive is the richness and diversity of the phenomenon a Sider manages to, in this way, to bring into philosophical contact with each other. The new question this orientation makes possible, or the new questions, the same vaulting ambition that takes him from the ancient Parmenidean problems of how there can be thought about what is not to the object directedness of thought, intentionality. Sorry, I don't know why I said it like that. Intentionality to a distinctive perspective on human freedom is also what helps us formulate new questions about how the appeal to freedom can be genuinely explanatory of the human action, and how we should understand the relation between the intentionality of thought and the intentionality of action. And hence the understanding of action itself is a form of thought. Being and Nothingness is not only about human freedom, it is a text that is plainly obsessed with the question of freedom and its meaning, and organizes all its many topics around it. In relation to freedom, it is less concerned about solving the traditional problem of freedom and determinism, and more concerned about understanding what is contained in the ordinary assumption of human freedom and the variety of ways it manifests itself. Part of Sader's great originality here is his drive to find the question of freedom, not only in, say, the conditions for holding people accountable, but virtually everywhere in human life, in the inescapability of some answer I give to how I relate myself to my past as well as my future, to the forms of intersubjectivity and what it is that is aimed at in seeking the desire of recognition of another person in the conflicting demands of the first person and third person points of view in understanding oneself. What is sometimes criticized as the unboundedness in Sutter's conception of human freedom is a reflection of the fact that the place of freedom in his system is less that of a human capacity among them, and more that of a principle of intelligibility of human affairs quite generally. Like, whatever that means. I did not like parse that properly. Saader is, of course, a novelist and a playwright as well as a philosopher, and part of the originality of Being in Nothingness as a piece of writing lies in the combination of an abstract and austere metaphysical picture with an essentially dramatic sense of the source of philosophical questions as they exhibit themselves in recognizable human situations. One of his great topics is the question of the forms of comprehensibility of human life and of a human life taken as a whole, especially in his later books by Jeanette and Flaubert. He is properly and profitably struck by the contradictory demands that we place on the comprehensibility of human life and action, and by the question of priority of different forms of comprehensibility we demand of ourselves and others. The metaphysics of the in itself and the for itself, or the self as facticity and the self as transcendence, will have earned its philosophical keep if they are what bring into view and make available for thought what Satter takes up in the sections of Being and Nothingness on the bad faith, on the nature of shame, and the self-consciousness that pertains to it, on the encounter with the others through the look, on the internal conflicts of love and desire, despite how long Being and Nothingness has been a looming presence on the philosophical scene. Much of it is only recently getting the attention it deserves on the Anglophone world. That's Europe, right? Europe and France. You know what I mean, probably. Satter's long chapter on the body is one of its first extended philosophical meditations in the modern era, on that meaning of one's identity with a certain living body, and is beginning to attract new attention today in his reflections on the different forms of self-consciousness, thetic or positional versus non-thetic or non-positional. As originally developed in his short work, The Transcendence of the Ego, are entering into contemporary discussions of the nature of self-knowledge and the first-person point of view. In many ways, Sader is as present on the scene as ever, but even in that presence we can see him struggling with his fame, and his life and personality somehow continue to exert a fascination out of balance with attention to the works that are supposedly the reason for any special interest in the details of the man's life. With new biographies of Sader appearing every few years and words like existential being part of every pundit's vocabulary, this new translation makes this an opportune time to go back to the source and see what it's all about. And here's the translation part. Oh my god. Can I just like wipe my whole face really quickly? Or my nose, I guess. Okay. I don't know if I want to read this. It's been more than 3 years. North Americans have to wait so long. Spelling and punctuation have been Americanized. As a flashlight as is possible disposal rather than a torch. Person who formerly walked on the pavement now finds himself on the sidewalk. New copy edited, a small number of typos. Some further thanks are to all these people here, out of respect for them. UK editors of the journal. Oh, fuck, you can't even see that. Okay, maybe I won't shout them out then. Just like people from the UK and Daniel Rothschild, uh-oh, who marked the, translation notes on abbreviation BN being a nothingness, EN, lettre de niaz, EH, existentialism and humanism. Oops. Now let me move this down a little. This better. Can you like see something? Can you see my fucking penis? No. Okay, good, because I'm not wearing any pants right now, so if it were to be revealed, I would go to jail immediately. No, sorry, I forgot I'm recording a video. Nah, whatever. Okay, yeah, it's his most important work, being a nothing, hereby, hereafter, BN. Then the canon of 20th century European philosophy is uncontested and is taught, read, and studied across the globe. In this introduction, my primary aim is to describe being and nothingness' philosophical impact, focusing especially on France and the English-speaking world, as a great deal of Sartre criticism and exegesis is now available. I will only briefly survey the context of the text. Instead, I offer an overview of its reception to provide the reader with some background to my translation, produced 3/4 of a century later. For remarks about the practical task of translating it, see the notes on the translation. Sartre went to teach philosophy in the French secondary school system after an uneventful stint of military service. He was exempt from an active period, and then he spent in a pure prisoner of war camp. Yeah, I guess he just went back to high school to teach philosophy. Oh my god, my hands are so goddamn cold. Oh man. Sorry, I should like get some gloves or something, but then I won't be able to flip the pages. Can you see? You can almost see my body. Sartre has published some impressive work in the 1930s. He was not yet well known, and his reputation as a writer was owed primarily to his 1938 novel La Nausée. Some short stories and plays, Les Mouches, was first staged in Paris in 1943. Book reviews, mostly of fiction, published in various periodicals, and other journalism. A year later, after Pathé had commissioned him to write the screenplay for a future film, Typhus, which was never made, Sartre believed he could earn a living as a full-time writer and gave up his teaching post. Not long after that, following his legendary public lecture, subsequently translated as EH. Was that? I already forgot. Existential and Humanism, in which Sartre presented a simplified version of his philosophy to a packed audience. In Paris in 1945, he became a national figure. By 1960s, Sartre's further writings, his association with Simone de Beauvoir, his appearances around the world, and his numerous political interventions that made him an international figure, a public intellectual who's frequently described as the most famous philosopher of the 20th century. Most famous philosopher, Being in Nothingness presents itself as a traditional, scholarly, and comprehensive work of philosophy. Sartre had not detached himself from the values of academia, but he adopts the persona of a distinguished professor who has the entire Western philosophical corpus at his fingertips. Doesn't corpus mean like, body, gore? I remember in Limbus Company yesterday when he said that, and also persona reference. Modern thought, he tells us in his opening sentence, has reduced the existent to the series of appearances that manifest it. How, if at all, do statements of this highly abstract kind bear any relation to the doctrines and slogans that we associate with existentialist philosophy? In fact, as readers are sometimes surprised to discover, the term existentialist is applied only retrospectively to the philosophy of being and nothingness, and does not figure it does not figure in the text. It does figure importantly in existentialism and humanism, where Sartre sums existentialism up quite simply in the famous claim that existence comes before essence. To explain this claim, Sartre, an atheist, contrasts it with a religious conception, according to which we are created by God. Had God created us, Sutter argues, our essence would precede our existence, but as it would be determined by God's intention. But there is no such thing as a human nature in a godless world, where man is nothing else but what he makes of himself. This contrast seems to suggest that existentialism is incompatible with religious beliefs, which would conflict Satter's acknowledgement in the same lecture that Christian existentialism also exists. But we will not pursue this here, okay? If you say so. The French title of E.H. L'existentialisme et un humanisme asserts the thesis that Sartre will be defending for his audience. And once it was published for his readers, no, I just spit on my book. Ew. Being and Nothingness is rather more obscure, and its subtitle, an essay in phenomenological ontology, is also unlikely to help anyone without a philosophical training. Ontology is the philosophical study of being, or of what exists and what is in the most general sense. And Sartre's fundamental claim is elegantly condensed within his title. He orders to account for being. Sartre is saying we need also to acknowledge nothingness, or non-beings, the relationship between this ontological project and the better known existentialist tenets that are, or existentialist tenets, not tenants, tenets that are associated with Sartre is in fact straightforward. The former provides the theoretical underpinnings for the latter. Nothingness explains why we humans are radically free, just as Sartre's account in Being and Nothingness of the interpersonal orientations he calls being for the other explains why our interpersonal relationships are likely to be hellish. The philosophy advanced in Being and Nothingness was of course attacked from the outset in the first instance, and before it had been translated into any other languages by Sartre's fellow French intellectuals. Indeed, just 2 years after the publication of the Etre de Niat, which was, for Being and Nothingness, Sartre announces that existentialism and humanism, his intentions to defend existentialism against several reproaches. Sartre is not too bothered by the censure of the Christians, for whom atheist existentialism is incompatible with morality. The points Sartre goes on to make in the lecture are supposed to refute that claim. He would have been more troubled by the attacks from the political left, and a discussion of existentialism and humanism that was organized specifically for Sartre to face his opponents. The communist activist Pierre Neville raised several criticisms that have often been repeated since. Indeed, only a year or so later, Herbert Marcuse's Reveal of Being and Nothingness, Marcuse, 1947, Sounded a similar hostile Marxist note. For Neville, Sartre's rejection of human nature was an illusion. Rather than abolishing the idea, Sartre was regressively proposing an alternative to it in the guise of human freedom. In more explicitly political terms, Naville had also accused Sartre of resurrecting liberalism. The most significant date in the history of being a nothingness is probably 1956, insofar as Sartre's international reputation as a philosopher depends, at least in the English-speaking world, on the first and, until now, the only English translation of Being a Nothingness, published in the US that year. It was translated by Hazel Barnes, 2008, this classic scholar at the University of Colorado, who took on the task because they admired. Okay, sorry. How much do I have left here? It's gonna take like an hour just to get to the beginning of the book. Holy fuck, and there's more notes on the translation, like fuck you, bro. Okay, sorry. Gonna take like a second to what do you call it? Can I just like pause for a second? Okay. The University of Colorado, who took on the task because she admired Sartre's philosophy and wanted to make it available to the Anglophone world. Warren's own work was also important in acquainting English speakers with Sartre's existentialism. Much of her academic output, in the forms of books and essays, took the form of critical discussions of his philosophy, and that was not all. Barnes also presented a series of programs about philosophy on Ohio University radio. Only at Ohio University, right? Am I right, guys? Only in Ohio. As well as a 10-episode television series about existentialism. Broader nationality in the United States, or broadcast nationally in the United States in the 1960s, called Self-Encounter, the study in existentialism. She even classified the memoir that she published in her 80s as a venture in existentialist autobiography. Barnes, 1997. These details alone suffice how radically the relations between intellectuals, both within and outside academic institutions, and between the wider public culture have changed since the middle of the 20th century. Sartre and Barnes have had different personalities and intellectual outlooks, but they both believe that philosophy should concern itself with contemporary human existence, and that it should correct our understanding of our existence in a way that would oblige us to live differently. And people were hungry for these ideas, willing to attend public lectures or to learn more from the radio, newspapers, and television. The philosophy of being and nothingness, with its emphasis on human freedom, agency, and responsibility, may also have held special appeal for a post-war public, open to change and desiring a fresh start. The early reception of, Etra Deniat in the English-speaking world also illustrates an intellectual cosmopolitanism within academic philosophy that is less common in today's more specialized and professional departments. In the post-war period, the gulf within philosophy that is still often thought to separate Sartre, a continental philosopher, from the Anglophone analytical traditions was not yet evident. Meanwhile, especially in the UK, the profile of the philosophers who showed an interest in Sartre's work, in some cases even before it had been translated, is remarkable. A.J. Ayer, who was a French speaker and had friends in Paris, published a 2-part discussion of Sartre's work in the journal Horizon in 1945, quoting lengthy passages from it in French. Iris Murdoch's first book was a slim volume on Sartre, published in 1953. Although she focuses mainly on his novels, she has also read Etre de Niet and other nonfiction by Sartre in French, and her book pays particular attention to the way Sartre's philosophy influences his fiction. Later decades saw further contribution by other major British philosophers. Stuart Hampshire reviewed Barnes' translation in The Observer in 1957, while Alistair McIntyre wrote the entry on existentialism for the Encyclopedia of Philosophy, published in 1967. 67. A few years later, McIntyre also contributed to a collection of critical essays on Sartre, edited by Mary Warnock, 1971, another prominent Sartre scholar. This collection also included an excellent discussion by Hide Ishiguro of Sartre's theory of the imagination, which helped establish Sartre as someone worthy of attention from analytical philosophers of mind. Two lines of thought about Sartre's philosophy, which jointly exhibit a marked ambivalence, are especially prominent in this first wave of Anglophone critical discussion. On the one hand, and as a legacy of logical positivism, hostility to traditional metaphysics would lead one to expect, there is a dismissive attitude towards Sartre's ontological framework in his recent articles. Ayer was particularly harsh about Sartre's assertions in relation to Niet, nothingness, which he judged to be literally nonsensical. Although Ayer does not mention Rudolf Carnap, his criticism here bears a strong resemblance to Carnap's earlier criticism of Heidegger's concept of das Nichts, usually translated as nothing, nor is this a historical coincidence, as Heidegger's concept influences Sartre's. Similarly, in his Observer review of Being and Nothingness, Hampshire mentions the malignant influences of Hegel and Heidegger, and asks whether the sophistries of Hegelian logic might conceal the banality of some of Sartre's observations. So let's read some of the footnotes here. Sartre's account of the imagination earned him a place within analytical aesthetics. So, see for example Hopkins, another much bigger collection of papers. And number 3, Isaiah Berlin, another influential figure in British philosophy at the time, was also centrally concerned with freedom. This was perhaps a missed opportunity. In a letter written in 1955, Berlin reports, "I've been reading, of all people, the detestable Sartre. The novels are too slimy and dark, but he's a clever man, and his moral philosophy is what I think I 3 out of 4 believe. I think I 75% believe. What a fool I was to be deceived by Freddie's articles in Horizon at the end of the war, which concentrated on Sartre's obscure logic and his attitudes to sex and proved it was all bogus. It is not. It is most imaginative and bold and important." Berlin, 2009. So 2009, I would have been born that time. Or I would have been I wouldn't have been born. I was born a little earlier. What I meant is I would have been alive when he said that. What was the last word from before? Before conceding in Sartre's favor. This criticism of traditional theories of mind is, at too many points, convincing for his whole system to be ignored. Hampshire, 1957-16. On the other hand, British commentators also notice the congruence between Sartre's phenomenological approach to philosophy and being and nothingness, subtitled An Essay in Phenomenological Ontology, and the empiricist's tradition in British philosophy. Iris Murdoch was especially alert to the similarity. It might even be argued that recent continental philosophers have been discovering with immense fuss what the English empiricists have known since Hume, who Husserl himself claimed as an ancestor. Sartre had studied the German philosopher Edmund Husserl (1859 to 1938) intensively in the 1930s, as he understood Husserl's phenomenological method. It directed philosophers to attend closely to human experiences of the world in order to describe the phenomena, the way the world appears to human consciousness, in rigorous detail. In an early paper about Husserl published in 1939, Sartre's excitement about the revolutionary method was palpable. Along with two other German philosophers, Hegel and Heidegger, Husserl performs part of the trio often referred to as the Three Ages, with whom Sartre enters into dialogue at various points in being and nothingness, usually in order to argue for the advantages of his views over theirs. As a fellow novelist philosopher, Iris Murdoch was well placed to understand the appeal for Sartre. Indeed, for anyone with literary ambitions of Husserl's descriptive philosophical methodology, the often quoted and highly evocative vignettes in Being and Nothingness, Pierre in the cafe, the woman on the date, the hiker who gives into fatigue, show Sartre taking full advantage of the opportunity to indulge in the detailed and stylish elaboration of fictional characters and scenarios which he thought the phenomenological method provided. And let's look down here at 4. By theories of mind, Hampshire is referring to post-Cartesian conceptions. Sartre's relationship to Descartes is too complicated to discuss here. 5. Describing the reception of Sartre in the U.S. and Fulton suggests that a perceived affinity with empiricism, although in this case it was with William James's philosophy rather than Hume's, also helped to legitimize Sartre's philosophy there. Sartre's early paper about Husserl is available in translation as Sartre in 1970. For a readable account of Husserl's phenomenology and its relation to Sartre's concerns, see Bakewell 2016. Okay, the phenomenological method provided, and some years later, when Murdoch came to downgrade her earlier opinion of Sartre, she produced a competing vignette of her own, featuring M and a mother and D, her daughter-in-law, to illustrate her criticism of Sartre. Murdoch, 1970. In America, it took longer for a serious interest in Sartre's philosophy to become established. With a few exceptions, most philosophical discussion post-dated and depended on Barnes' translation. The time lag seems to have also made it difficult for Sartre's ideas to get an unprejudiced hearing. By the 1950s, Sartre was often presented outside France as a lightweight celebrity whose philosophy did not deserve to be taken seriously outside cafe society. Some of Sartre's critical articles about American society, written after a visit in 1945, have been translated into English in the 1950s. His increasingly vocal political criticisms of the West also made him enemies. Apparently, Hazel burns herself before she read any of Sartre's philosophical work, had dismissed existentialism as a fashionable philosophy of defeatism and despair. The early reception of Sartre in the UK and the US was idiosyncratic in a number of ways. First, Sartre was often presented as a moral philosopher and accordingly criticized from that perspective. Okay, let's take a minute to read the little footnotes down here. 7. The exceptions are interesting, however. Wilfred de Sand, who was born in Belgium and studied in Lille, was a native French speaker who apparently met Sartre during the Second World War. He moved to philosophy. He moved to the U.S. He moved to philosophy. No, he moved to the U.S. in 1948, gained a doctorate there, and spent his working life as a university professor of philosophy. His first book, published in 1954, was a critical study of Etre de Niet, and relied on the French text de Sand, 1954. Marjorie Gren, an American who spent time studying in Germany with Heidegger and Jaspers in the early 1930s, published various books and papers about existentialism. The Canadian-born Robert Denun Cumming, or his name is Cumming, served as a U.S. soldier in France in the Second World War and spent some time as a student in the Sorbonne. Although his own work on Sartre, coming 1991 to 2001. Wow, bro was coming for 10 years, bro. Was only published later. He introduced generations of students to contemporary European thought in his class at Columbia University. Herbert Marcuse, who emigrated from Germany in 1932, was already developing his new interpretation of Marxism, which he published his unfavorable review of Etre de Niet in 1947. Or I guess he didn't do that, but whatever. Beauvoir, also had an international name by now as a controversial French intellectual. She visited America separately in 1947 and published her own ambivalent observations in French later, translated as Beauvoir in 1999. I was coming for a whole decade, bruh. Pause. I already made the joke, but it's pretty funny. Made me laugh a little. Oh, I forgot to read the last little bit. Marjorie Gren presented existentialism as a philosophy in which the central virtue was authenticity. A line of thought that was also taken up and criticized by Charles Taylor. Alvin Plantinga's hostile 1958 paper, An Existentialist's Ethics, claims Sartre's account of freedom was incompatible with any genuine morality, and interpreted Sartre as a moral nihilist. From today's standpoint, and with the benefits of closer attention to being and nothingness, as well as historical hindsight, this focus seems misguided. Sartre himself states explicitly at the end of Being and Nothingness, and in some important footnotes, that an adequate discussion of morality would have to appear in a future work. But he never succeeded to fulfilling that promise. Although we have some idea of the evolution of his moral thinking from the posthumously published Notebooks for an Ethics, Sartre in 1992. And let's go down here and read the footnote. The Notebook's many references to the desirability of a social revolution suggest that at least part of Sartre's reason for abandoning his work on morality was that political imperatives had come to seem more fundamental. Okay, now let's go back to where he wrote his book. This moral perspective may have been encouraged to some extent by Barnes, although she was aware of Sartre's reticence in Being and Nothingness. Her interest in Sartre was driven by her strong desire for a credible post-religious morality, a possibility she continued to explore in her academic writing. Many commentators also read back into Being and Nothingness the optimistic moral idea that Sartre had sketched out in existentialism and humanism, erroneously conflating these two texts. So they got them mixed up or something. Most generally, the categories used within analytical philosophies and the tacitly accepted boundaries of the discipline have shaped the approach of Anglophone philosophers to being and nothingness. For example, it is probably because Freud is rarely included outside France within the philosophical curriculum. The Sartre's conception of existentialist psychoanalysis has been ignored, while on the other hand, his account of bad faith is seen as a contribution to the debate within the philosophy of mind about self-deception, and his account of shame is assessed with reference to the skeptical problem of other minds. In her introduction to the 1965 edition of her translation, Barnes complained that her piecemeal attention to being and nothingness hindered readers' understanding. One can no more understand Sartre's view of freedom, for instance, without considering his peculiar view of consciousness, that one can judge Plato's doctrine that knowledge is recollection without relating to the theory of ideas. What critics usually fail to see is that Sartre is one of the few 20th century philosophers to present us with a total system. 10. So if you go down here and read 10, it just says reference Barnes 1965. The predominantly ahistorical outlook of analytical philosophy has also inflected the study of Sartre. Not infected, with a few exceptions in spite of Sartre's frequent references to the three H's. Most Anglosphere commenters have said little about Sartre's relation to these predecessors, or even about his place in the European post-Kantian tradition more broadly. Work still remains to be done exploring Sartre's relation not only to the three H's, but to more shadowy figures behind the text, including Kierkegaard, Bergson, Leibniz, and the Stoics. And going to footnote 11, it says the exceptions include the following: Aquila, 1998, Bayasu, 2011, Baldwin, 1979, and Gerdner, 2005 to 2009. 2005 and 2009. More of this type of work has been published in France and Germany, where philosophy tends to be studied from a more historical perspective. See, for example, Hartmann, 1966, and Simont, 1998. It is perhaps especially surprising that so little attention was given to Sartre's relationship with Heidegger. After all, Heidegger was still alive when Being and Nothingness appeared, and he predeceased Sartre by only 4 years. Footnote 12. Various reasons may explain this neglect. In particular, I think Heidegger's writing style was a deterrent. It is difficult to imagine Ayer, Murdoch, Hampshire, or Berlin enjoying his dense and humorless prose. In fact, Heidegger's influence pervades Being and Nothingness, although Sartre does not always acknowledge it. Heidegger's example may be responsible for Being and Nothingness's title, which can be seen as a response to Heidegger's most famous philosophical work, Being and Time, and is surely the reason for the mention of ontology in its subtitle. Heidegger's example may have influenced Sartre's decision to make nothingness into a central philosophical concept. Sartre's focus on man's practical immersion in his everyday tasks, the choice of the activity of questioning as an investigative point of departure, and the redeployment of anguish within a new framework are also all indebted to Heidegger. 13. Footnote 13. Of course, Sartre also disagrees with Heidegger on many topics, including the significance of human death and the nature of our relation with others. Despite all this debt, most of Sartre's reading of Heidegger appears to have been in French translation, and he relied heavily on a small anthology of extracts and essays translated by Henry Corbin and published in France. Published in France in 1993. Heidegger, 1938. Or 1938, I don't know why I said 1993. Sartre borrowed the phrase human reality, la réalité humaine, directly from Corbin, who had used it to translate Heidegger's term Dasein. Thus, this monstrous translation, as Jacques Derrida famously described it a quarter of a century later, Derrida in 1982, was subsequently held against Sartre in conjunction with other evidence, including, importantly, existentialism and humanism. This usage was thought to warrant dismissal of being and nothingness as a philosophy resting on outdated and unacceptable humanist premises. The anti-humanist criticism was one among several lines of attack within a broader critical backlash against Sartre that was at its height in the 1960s and 1970s. In both France and the English-speaking world, feminist theory provided a different kind of opposition, about which more later. Insofar as it involves Sartre, the so-called humanism debate begins in 1946 when Jean Balfret, a French philosopher with an interest in German thought, wrote to Heidegger with the intention of re-establishing a dialogue between French and German philosophy after the disruption of the Second World War. 14. See Baldwin for further discussion of this debate. In Existentialism and Humanism, Sartre had cited Heidegger as a fellow existentialist, and Beaufort was effectively inviting Heidegger to respond. Heidegger's reply, published in an expanded version as a letter on humanism, Heidegger 1978b, was disdainful. It did not help that almost 2 decades had elapsed since the publication of Being and Time, and Heidegger's philosophical focus had shifted. Although Sartre is not exclusively in the letter, Heidegger makes it clear that in his view, Sartre is one of the many Western philosophers who have misconceived the proper task of thought. Sartre's focus on existentialism and humanism on free human action is, Heidegger suggests, superficial. Instead, we should develop our thinking in a way that lets itself be claimed by being, so that it can only say the truth of being. To do this, it is important to notice the resources of language and to reconceptualize our relationship with it. Indeed, the first page of the letter contains one of Heidegger's most quoted claims. Language is the house of being. In its home, man dwells. Heidegger 1978. Why does Heidegger reject humanism, at least as it is normally conceived? Although the letter pursues several relevant lines of thoughts, the central claim is the way that the human being is interpreted throughout the history of humanism is insufficiently radical and sets us on the wrong philosophical path. For example, the Greek view that a human is essentially a rational animal helps itself uncritically to a conception of life and locates humans, among other things, in a way that conceals our difference, which does not consist for Heidegger in rationality. Behind this criticism lies a more fundamental problem, namely that every humanism is either grounded in a metaphysical or is itself made to be the ground of one. Accordingly, every humanism is metaphysical. Heidegger, 1978. Heidegger's critique of metaphysics is an immense topic. For our purposes, the key idea to retain Heidegger's claim, which is taken up in Derrida's philosophy, that the Western philosophical tradition has repeatedly determined being in terms of presence. For Heidegger, humanism is complicit with this metaphysical tendency. In its Cartesian incarnation, for example, humans are characterized as thinking subjects to whom beings are made present, or represented as objects. Derrida elaborates the themes of the metaphysics of presence with particular reference to the question of linguistic meaning and reference, which had by the late 20th century had become dominant in Anglophone philosophy as well as continental Europe. Had French thought taken a different path after Heidegger's anti-Sartrean intervention, the question of humanism might have been forgotten. But the massive impact of structuralism is basically in virtually every branch of the human sciences in France in the 1960s resulted in a range of anti-humanist theoretical proposals that were thought to be antithetical to Sartre's earlier philosophy, by authors who were often explicitly critical of Sartre. As the name suggests, structuralism's basic insight is that the production of meaning, or this is broadly understood to include some linguistic meaning, or to include linguistic meaning, the meaning of literary texts, and the meaning of social practices, depends on pre-existing and socially shared structures or systems that determine and delimit the signifying possibilities available to the people who inhabit them. A host of famous French thinkers are associated with this paradigm, including Barthes, Foucault, Lévi-Strauss, Lacan, and Althusser. See Gutzing 2001 for a helpful interview of many of his figures, or a helpful overview. Across these different fields of investigation, Nolly, I have no idea what I'm reading, and also I would really love to get to the fucking end of this book. Look how many goddamn, what, more translator acknowledgements, like, come on, man. Being and nothingness. Look how much is left just to get to the start of the book. I was gonna be like, oh man, I'm just gonna read this one section. It's already like page 30. I think there are like 100 pages of introductions. Like, what the hell is your problem? Oh my god. And it's only been like since before I read for like 45 minutes. I would like it to be like an hour and 30 minutes. And then I can take like a 15-minute break. But like, holy crap. Holy fuck. Lois, I'm coming. Okay. Different fields of investigation. The structuralist model denies explanatory primacy to individual subjectivity and emphasizes instead the often quoted decentering of the subject and the death of the author. Footnote 16. Foucault's eloquent concluding paragraphs to the order of things are often quoted to the same effect. Foucault states that man is an invention of recent date, and if the fundamental arrangements of knowledge were to crumble, man would be erased, like a face is drawn in sand at the edge of the sea. Of course, and then back to footnote 16. Sartre was portrayed as an advocate of the individualist humanism held by this body of work to be untenable. Of course, a case can and has been made in Sartre's defense. Champions have portrayed and promoted a new Sartre. It should also be noted that many of the French theorists who have distanced themselves from Sartre were separated from him by only a few years in age. Sartre's prominence in public life needed to be questioned if they were to displace him. A further question, which some have answered affirmatively, is whether Sartre's post-being and nothingness writings show him following a similar trajectory to the structuralist theorist in any case. So footnote 17, see for example Cause 1992, or 1992. The feminist attacks on Sartre were largely independent of this debate and arose as part of the wider feminist zeitgeist in the second half of the 20th century. One strand of feminist discussion had been biographically centered insofar as it examined Sartre's relationship with Beauvoir and his intellectual debts to her through a feminist lens. In this context, the relevancy of being and nothingness is exhausted by the light it throws on those wider questions. Whether, for example, it reviews Beauvoir's influence. For this reason, I will merely remind the reader that Sartre dedicated being and nothingness to Castor and move on. Number 18, Le Castor, which is French for beaver, was Sartre's nickname for Beauvoir. See Diegli and Gollum for the question of Beauvoir's influence. There's so many damn characters in this book, bro. The so-called second wave of feminism was at its height in the 1970s when two American scholars published an influential article, Holes in Slime, Sexism in Sartre's Psychoanalysis, Collins and Pierce, 1978. Their purpose was to show Sartre's examples of being and nothingness of the psychoanalysis of things manifest a sexism that contradicts being and nothingness' basic anti-essentialist standpoint. In this passage, they cite from Barnes' translation, Sartre considers the significance of holes and slime. Footnote 19, Sartre's French term is visqueux, which, as I argue below, should be translated as viscous rather than slimy. He tells us slime, has a negative ontological meaning, insofar it signifies a threat to consciousness or an inversion of its certain characteristics, lucidity, freedom, etc. Sartre describes the action of slime as a moist and feminine sucking, which is also the revenge of the in itself, a sickly sweet feminine revenge. Is he calling women slimes that suck? But they're okay, you know what? Whatever, bro. Wow, Sartre. That's not very feminist of you. What's your fucking problem, dude? Oh, you know you can't say that stuff anymore these days. Anyway, sorry. Of course, this is a little, what do you call it, obviously it's gonna be a little divisive or whatever. Collins and Pierce's objections to Sartre's treatment of holes are less forceful. As Sartre mentioned several types of hole, including non-corporeal ones. Nonetheless, his suggestion that the vagina is a mouth and a voracious mouth which devours the penis did not please them. Yep. Yep. Okay. One response to these criticism voiced by Barnes and other critics points out that these damning passages do not play an important role in being in nothingness. It would be absurd to take them to be gendering. Sartre's ontology, i.e., to infer that for itself is implicitly male and the in itself implicitly female throughout. According to this defense, we ought to distinguish the incidental sexism of Sartre's imagery from his central philosophical doctrines. Sorry, I'm burping a lot. I'm burping up all the food I ate. That's gross. As Barnes concluded, a full investigation of the linguistics codes in Sartre's writing would reveal him to be a man comfortably ensconced in a world of male dominance. Barnes, 1990. But Sartre's supporters argued we need to look beyond the regrettably sexist imagery and language in order to notice the emancipatory potential of Sartre's basic anti-essentialism. 20, footnote 20. Feminists have found other elements in Being a Nothingness useful. Example, its account of the objectifying effect of the other's gaze. A collection of feminist interpretations of Sartre. C. Murphy, 1999. Alright. However, in the defense of Sartre, this defense of Sartre may not work in relation to another, more theoretically sophisticated line of feminist criticism. According to the French philosopher Michel de Dieppe, 2007, a philosophical imaginary expressing male outlook and male privilege can be discovered within the Western philosophical canon as a whole, and Being in Nothingness is no exception, as this orientation is largely unconscious and surfaces most often in imagery or examples that may appear to be incidental. We cannot dismiss these aspects of a text. One of Ledueff's most compelling analyses focuses on Sartre's depiction of women in his discussion of bad faith, not only the well-known woman on the day who tries not to note the suitor's sexual ambitions, but also the unfortunate woman featured in some case studies from Steckel and cited by Satter, who claim not to enjoy sex with their husbands. Although both Steckel and Satter disagree, Ledueff, 2007, in her unconventional book, Ledueff also draws on a wide range of other materials. Including Beauvoir's memoirs and letters from Sartre arguing that the real-life consequence of their intellectual partnership was effectively that Beauvoir was deprived herself of the status of a philosopher. Genevieve Lloyd, The Man of Reason, first published in 1984, also surveyed the Western philosophical canon from a feminist point of view, although through a slightly different lens. Lloyd, 1993. Lloyd claims that the ideal of reason is repeatedly associated in philosophy with maleness. This association, moreover, is sometimes inherited by philosophers who may not consciously appreciate its workings. Lloyd argues that the idea of transcendence that Beauvoir took over from Sartre and via Sartre from Hegel and used in the second sex is contaminated in this way and therefore an unsuitable feminist ideal. Ledueff's and Lloyd's books are insightful, and their remarks about Being in Nothingness deserve attention. Still, we should note that the ambition and generality of these surveys mean that Sartre is seen to instantiate a rule rather than an exception. In addition, these critics suggest that the bias they are documenting needs to be unearthed. It is not always obvious, and nor do the philosophers who exhibit it even necessarily intend it. In this respect, these feminist interpretations of Western philosophy share some of the features of Derrida's deconstructionalist approach to philosophy, published in France by several influential books and articles in the late 1960s and 1970s. Footnote 21. Derrida continued to publish until his death in 2014, but the classic deconstructive texts appeared in the late 1960s and 1970s. Back to 21. Some of these writings target the structuralism that was then so fashionable in France because of their deflationary effect. Derrida is often described as a post-structuralist. For Derrida, there's something quixotic about the view that Is quixotic like synonymous to like heroic, quixotic, or like, idealistic? And also Don Quixote reference from Limbus Company. About the review that a signifying system can be mastered once its basic structures have been identified. Derrida's own writing focuses especially on the case of language. One of the features that makes his prose difficult to read and even more difficult to translate is the multiple performances of language eluding authorial control. Puns, ambiguities, and neologisms are abound in Derrida's highly self-conscious texts. Derrida's ambition and complicated project is difficult to set up, in part because it deliberately resists presentation as a set of doctrines. But a few further remarks about his relationship to satire are called for. As we saw, Derrida blames Sartre for using the term human reality, and more broadly, for perpetuating a naively anthropological or humanist reading of Heidegger's work. Derrida 1982b. Nonetheless, the effect of Derrida's wider audience in this essay is ultimately to dilute Sartre's specific accountability for the persistence of humanism in recent philosophy by showing, for example, that despite Heidegger's stated intention in his letter and elsewhere, there is a residual humanism in his thought too. As Derrida puts it, what must hold our interest is the kind of profound justification whose necessity is subterranean, which makes the Hegelian, Husserlian, and Heideggerian critiques or delimitations of metaphysical humanism appear to belong to the very sphere of that which they criticize or delimit. How does being in nothingness stand in relation to these more recent developments in French philosophy? Although the phenomenon of language is occasionally discussed, it is not at the center of Sartre's concerns. Moreover, despite occasional instances of linguistic playfulness in the text, Sartre's style and tone exhibit a pre-Derridian confidence that language can be used to say what we mean. That would not have been possible, or at least not without discussion 25 years later. The same confidence emerges in some of Sartre's reflection on his own linguistic practice, as the following exchange from an interview with Michael Courtot 1975 shows. Your philosophical manuscripts are written in longhand, with almost no crossing out or erasures, while your literary manuscripts are very much worked over, perfected. Why is there this difference? The objectives are different. In philosophy, every sentence should have one meaning. The work I did on Les Mots, for example, attempting to give multiple and superimposed meanings to each sentence would be bad in philosophy. Okay, can I have my TikTok break now? But if Sartre's attitude towards language and being in nothingness is old-fashioned, the proponents of the new Sartre have shown that in other respects and sympathetically read, being in nothingness is ahead of its time. The humanist criticism voiced by Heidegger and one of the structuralists, for example, often draws on a simplifying interpretation of Sartre's Cartesian standpoint in being in nothingness that can easily be shown to be incomplete. Note 22, Heidegger's attack, in particular, can be seen to be limited by its reliance on existentialism and humanism rather than being in nothingness. For Descartes, the cogito affords the subject indubitable first-person knowledge where the mind and body are two separate substances which are respectively immaterial and material. In Sartre's hands, all these elements are radically modified. The reflective standpoint of the cogito is shown to be epistemologically unreliable. Consciousness is not a substance, and in addition, it has no contents. Moreover, Sartre's characterization of the for itself as being what it is not and not being what it is decenters the Sartrean subject and undermines the possibility of self-coincidence in a way that arguably keeps the metaphysics of presence at bay. Footnote 23. For fuller discussion, see Farrell, Fox, and Howells. While wherever its merits, the new Sartre exemplifies being in nothingness's relevance to later French thoughts, enlisting it in a dialogue with more recent philosophy. At the same time, academic philosophy in the English-speaking world, which typically resists European fashion, has come to accept being in nothingness as a classical text that belongs in the post-Kantian tradition. I hope this new translation will help the reader to form her own view of it for herself, responsibly and freely as Sartre would have wanted. Okay, using her. Yeah, what about me, man? I guess that was the feminist part, right? So that's probably why they used her. Whatever. Notes on the translation, Sarah Richmond. Alright, Sarah, let's see what you got. Frederick Olofsson, an American philosopher, reviewed Barnes' translation of Being in Nothingness in 1958, and he was unsympathetic to its content and also commented harshly on its style. The French text presents notoriously a thankless task. It is endlessly repetitive, full of ugly neologisms, and in places quite unintelligible. Inevitably, the English version shares these defects to a degree, and readers are not likely to find it much easier going than the original. When readers of this translation encounter stylistic infelicities, repetition, and ramblings, I hope they will bear Olofsson's sentences in mind. It is common for translators to dissociate themselves from the content of their translated text, but the despair I've sometimes felt has usually been in connection with Being in Nothingness's style. Where they seem legitimate, I've taken steps detailed below to mitigate stylistic defects, but in respect, the options available to a responsible translator are limited. Punctuation is the main area where I felt licensed to depart from Sartre's practices in order to make the text more readable. Written French often contains long sentences with multiple subordinate clauses that are often punctuated by commas. Sartre uses such sentences throughout the text. Good English prose usually works differently. Sentences tend to be shorter, and parentheses, colons, and semicolons, as well as commas, are used to order the meaning. It seems appropriate for a translator to take advantage, where she can, of these differences, making some of Sartre's sentences shorter by dividing one French sentence into two or more English ones, and/or punctuating them differently with more semicolons and colons and fewer commas. I do not think I have been unfaithful. In the same vein, I have not translated all the numerous instances of en effet, indeed, or in effect in the French. This phrase is often used more for emphasis than to add information, so where it seems unnecessary in the English, I've sometimes deleted it. Another phrase Sartre uses frequently is c'est-à-dire, which translates literally as that is to say, because it would badly clutter the English text if I translated each instance like that. I've often used the near synonymous ie instead, as the rules for the use of quotation marks also differ between French and English. Example, within dialogue, or to show that words are mentioned rather than used. I've also taken advantage of this difference and introduced quotation marks where that improves clarity. Satyr likes to hyphenate phrases. It is lucky you got this habit from Heidegger. I have not felt entitled to interfere with this practice, despite the many cumbersome word strings that ensue, presumably as in Heidegger's being in the world. The hyphens are intended, at least in most instances, to emphasize the indissolubility of the terms they can join. This is true, for example, of reality humane, which I translate as human reality. In other instances, the purpose of the hyphen is unclear. I have no idea why Sartre hyphenates people of the world, Monday people at yen 601, or human will of Alantu main at yen 486. Sartre is also inconsistent in his use of hyphens, using the same phrase at different points in the text with or without them, although this is puzzling. I have not interfered. I have not interfered with some hyphenated phrases. Sutter switches with apparent arbitrariness between one word order and its reverse, as for example, in other object and at EN266 and object other at EN296. I sometimes switch the order of the hyphenated words in translation. French and English follow different rules with respect to word order anyway, but there are also instances where I've switched the word order in the English, not because it is grammatically required, but for the sake of a more euphonious piece. What are the main differences between Barnes? Sorry, can I wipe my eyes? Man. I don't know if you guys can relate, but it's like when it's like when I'm reading or doing stuff or looking down, I just tear up a lot. Yeah, it's like it's annoying to have to wipe off my face every time, or like my nose gets runny. I remember in high school, I had to just like sit there. I would just sit there and suffer because I was too anxious to get up and grab a napkin, which probably annoyed everyone around me. Oh, one time I was in fucking a class, and there's this guy who like he probably had some condition with his fucking face, or he just had to keep sniffling and fucking sneezing and snorting, and it was so loud, bro. And it's like this guy would just like this genuinely disturb the entire class. This was in university. And it was so annoying, bro. And he came to every lecture too. Fuck me. Anyway, what are the main differences between Barnes's older translations and mine? Barnes's achievement was immense, especially when no one bears in mind the limited technology at her disposal, no computer, internet, and etc. And her translation of Being in Nothingness is far better than any other first English translations of French philosophical texts from the first period. Although some of Barnes' decisions were flawed, she made a number of outright mistakes. These shortcomings alone might not warrant a new translation. Fortunately, and in part of advances in technology and professional standards as well as the availability of recent philosophical scholarship and translation, I've been able to enhance the text in a number of ways I hope readers will find helpful. Many of the writings to which Sartre refers, either directly or more elusively, were unavailable in English translation in the 1950s. To give just one example, Heidegger's Being in Time was first translated to English by John McCurry and Edward Robinson in 1962. This carefully thought, annotated translation has enabled me to find the source of many of such numerous Heidegger references in the published English version, and to quote or discuss or direct the reader to the corresponding passage. In the same way, of course, I've been able to benefit from other reliable translations of other philosophical works, in particular those by Husserl and Hegel. These English translations, in conjunction with the additional critical discussion by Anglophone scholars, have resulted in the existence of various lexicons associated with different European philosophers. This has allowed me, in some cases, to translate a French term into an English term from the relevant lexicon and thus to maintain a cross-textual consistency. In some instances, this works well. I followed most translations of the Bergson, for example, in rendering elan as impulse rather than the alternative terms offered by French to English dictionaries, example, momentum. But this accumulated history also creates complicated situations in which some advantages have to be sacrificed for others. Sartre's negative vocabulary offers an illustration. Sartre would have found the term le néant in Corbyn's translation of Heidegger's What is Metaphysics, where Corbyn used it to translate the German Das Nichts. Heidegger, 1938. Sartre was also familiar with Bergson's rejection of the idea le néant in L'Evolution Créatrice, translated in Bergson, 1911. Many English translators of Heidegger render Das Nichts as the nothing, while Bergson's term la néant was for a long time rendered as the not. 3 different terms then are in circulation in English: nothing, nothingness, nothing, and the not. Further complications arise when one tries to reproduce in English the connections between the words in this negative vocabulary. The intended assonance of Heidegger's controversial sentence das Nichtet has been reproduced in a translation suggested by some Heidegger scholar as the nothing noths. In Wood, 1999, Sartre built a parallel assonance into his French text by inventing the verb niatisser. What the hell is assonance, and is it the opposite of dissonance? Assonance meaning the repetition of a vowel or diphthong. Or dissonance, a lack of harmony. Okay. I don't really know what that means. Sartre built a parallel assonance into his French text by inventing the verb niatisser. To reproduce this assonance in English, one could either translate niatisser by borrowing the verb to noth from Heidegger or making up a new verb among the same lines to nothingness, perhaps. However, niantir also closely resembles the existing French verb anéantir, to annihilate, and this connection speaks in favor of translating it into English as annihilate. This was Barnes' solution, and after some reflection, I have endorsed it. The widespread use of Burns' translation has, of course, naturalized some of her vocabulary, and where I disagree with her decision about a significant term, I had to consider the cost to some readers of introducing a change. For example, Sartre frequently uses the noun surgissement and the related verb surgir to characterize the way the for itself arises within the world. Surgir is not an unusual verb in everyday French, so where it simply means to arise, with an implication of abruptness that sometimes speaks in favor of a phrase such as to suddenly appear or to crop up. The related noun is harder to translate. One option might be sudden appearance, but that would blur the boundaries of the term appearance in being and nothingness, which is better confined, in my view, to instances where Sartre uses appearance or apparition. Often with a phenomenological sense, the difficulties are clear. Nonetheless, I think Barnes' choice of the term upsurge was eccentric. Upsurge is rarely used in English, and the first entry for it in most dictionary defines it as an increase of something in its size or incidence. The word can be used, for example, in a phrase such as a recent upsurge of crime. Less commonly, the verb can be used intransitively to mean to surge up, as in the water upsurged. Perhaps Barnes had this usage in mind. I have decided to use the verb to arise instead, and where necessary, the noun arising, as these are more faithful to the register used in the French. The, the case for conservatism in relation to existing translation is sometimes strengthened by the weight of published commentary elsewhere. Even if I could think of an accurate way of translated reality humane. Man, please stop. Even if I could think of an accurate way of translating reality humane, that did less violence to Heidegger's term Dessin, the humanism debate discussed in my introduction, has now made Sartre and Corbin's decision into a significant event in the French reception of Heidegger. To reverse that decision would be like rewriting history, and in any case, it is not the role of a translator to correct the authors of her text, because of the many people whom such Sartre refers to have faded into obscurity, have provided many identifying footnotes. In addition, where Sartre refers to passages or arguments in works by other philosophers, I have tried to reference these for the readers. Note that I have not provided explanatory footnotes for obvious names, example Plato. In the remainder of these notes, I list some further elements of my translation, either to start explain my decision or to provide further information, or both. I start with parts of speech and move on to various clusters of vocabulary. Alright, bro, I've had enough. Just, I'm at my limit. I gotta stop reading. I can like play video games, but I'm not reading a single more word. Let's put this down. That was a good. Oh. Oh, I forgot to end the recording. Sorry. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe and all that good stuff.